So hello everyone, I'm Ben Borenstein. I'm an assistant professor at Villanova University. I'd like to thank the Journal of Advertising Research and the Advertising Research Foundation for this exciting opportunity to be a part of this event on ad engagement. I'll be presenting collaborative work with Tyler Milfeld and Luke Nolan on the topic of life transitions and how consumers respond to ad repetition. Now, life transitions are a relevant topic probably to most of us in this room, but surprisingly understudied in advertising research. So the typical consumer experiences a life transition every 12 to 18 months, and these experiences vary. So 12% of the US population moved to a new residence this year. Nearly 60% of people are in the process of seeking employment or changing jobs, and over 130 million people gave birth to a new child this year. This project actually started when I was in the midst of a life transition, moving on from my doctoral program at the University of Miami. And I actually very recently experienced an exciting life transition. My daughter was born 8 months ago, and reflecting on these experiences, my worldview has drastically changed. And what my colleagues and I wanted to do is understand how consumers might interpret their life changes and adapt to those behaviors. So the digital era presents advertisers with increased opportunity to target based on life transitions, based on a multitude of variables, attitudinal, lifestyle, but also some platforms actually offer the opportunity to specifically target life events, such as Google Ads, who note that there's a correlation between life events and purchasing behavior. And there are organizations that utilize life events in their targeting practices heavily, such as the Knot Worldwide in terms of wedding planning. But often what we find is that these life events are underutilized in targeting practices and present a massive audience for audience-based buying. And what my colleagues and I want to specifically research is how do consumers in a life transition respond to ad repetition? And I'll go over why there's a link, we think, between ad repetition and life transitions. So, by definition, life transitions cause an unsettling degree of uncertainty. They're a temporal period marking the end of a known reality and the beginning of an unknown reality. So, it forces consumers into behavioral adaptation, and oftentimes there's a lot of hesitation to embrace change. And what prior research finds is that in regard to consumers in a life transition, oftentimes they do not embrace that change, but rather look for predictability or familiarity in the environment. They might look towards familiar foods or even recurring subscriptions rather than switching to a new subscription. So they find comfort in this predictable environment. And what we find is interesting is there's potential for advertisers to simulate that predictable environment for consumers. So what we do in our studies is we look at a massed approach to advertising and running ads back to back to create this predictable environment for consumers in the life transition and to explore whether that sustains their enjoyment of advertising. And if we look towards prior research, there's actually a lot of value in terms of repeat experience, even though there's in general a focus on novelty in advertising much of the time. Repeat experience offers value in the fact that when you look at novelty, there's a risk that enjoyment may not be comparable. And I think to my daughter, who listens to the same song on repeat over and over again, there's comfort in that predictability. And adults are no different in that if we look to prior research, especially when consumers are faced with uncertainty, they're often choosing repeat experiences over novel experiences. So they might even choose to repeat the same restaurant as opposed to trying a new restaurant, for example. So applying this to advertising research, what we're predicting is that when the typical consumer exhibits a sharp decline in enjoyment in response to ad repetition, we're suggesting that consumers in a life transition might exhibit sustained enjoyment or more favorable brand attitudes in response to ad repetition. So if we look at this graph, upon the initial exposure, when that advertisement is novel, we're not predicting a difference between those in a life transition versus those who are not, but rather that consumers in a life transition will embrace or find comfort in the repetition, and their enjoyment will decline at a slower pace relative to those who are not experiencing that life change. So we test this framework in a series of 4 experiments. The first experiment, we look at a static ad from Burger King and explore whether those in a life transition versus those who are not exhibit ad enjoyment in response to ad repetition over time. Experiment 2, we wanted to increase robustness for our findings, so we looked at an unbranded advertisement to rule out any brand familiarity effects. And then study 3, this time we explore that same design for Whole Foods to increase generalizability, but we also wanted to look at brand attitudes after exposure to repeated advertisements. And then lastly, we look at a dynamic ad from Charmin and a choice, an active decision that consumers make between choosing to sustain enjoyment and repeat that advertisement versus switch to a different advertisement to a different brand. So the first 3 experiments look at a static ad with a similar methodology, and then experiment 4 is a real behavioral choice experiment. So I'll quickly go over these different experiments and our findings. So in the first experiment, and across the experiments, we use cloud research platform for online data collection due to its high quality for advertising research. We also incorporated screening procedures across all experiments to screen out automated responses. For the first 3 experiments, we used a design adapted from prior literature where we manipulate whether or not consumers are immersed in the experience of a life transition. And then we expose that participant to an advertisement, this time for Burger King, 10 seconds exposure, 7 different times. But after each exposure in that interval, we allow them to rank that advertisement on a 100-point sliding scale to indicate their enjoyment. And what we find is that, as predicted at the first exposure at time 1, there was no difference between the life transition condition, control condition, in terms of their enjoyment of the advertisement. But if we look at subsequent exposures and the slope in enjoyment over time, we find that there's a more gradual slope in ad enjoyment decline in the life transition condition versus those who are exposed to the control. So what we wanted to do next is replicate these findings with an unbranded advertisement to rule out brand familiarity and some other confounds. So we used the same design in experiment 2. And to give more context in terms of that immersive experience, consumers reflected on a recent life transition or a typical day. And what we do in that final experiment is we actually look at whether or not consumers are currently experiencing a real life transition. But for experiment 2, what we find is, in replication of experiment 1, that at time 1, no difference in enjoyment, but after subsequent exposures, those who were immersed in a life transition exhibited more sustained ad enjoyment versus the control condition. So we were excited about these findings across unbranded and branded advertisements. So what we wanted to do next is look at whether or not this not only affects enjoyment, but also brand attitudes. So in experiment 3, we added a measure after participants were exposed to the advertisement 7 times, in which brand familiarity was measured through a composite scale. So again, at time 1, we found no difference in ad enjoyment for the Whole Foods advertisement across conditions. But as we looked across time for repeated ad exposure, there's a more gradual slope in decline for the life transition condition. And importantly, we also found a strong effect in regard to brand attitude, where those in the life transition condition were exhibiting a more favorable brand attitude after multiple exposures to the Whole Foods ad versus those who were not immersed in a life transition. So what we wanted to do next is increase the validity of these findings by using a different design. And we actually this time measured whether or not consumers were currently experiencing a life transition rather than manipulated the experience of immersion. And then we exposed participants to a 30-second Charmin ad. And we operationalized sustained enjoyment in this context by offering consumers the real choice to continue enjoying that Charmin ad or switch to a different product from a different brand and to view a different advertisement. We also incorporate a variety of control measures, including but not limited to brand familiarity, product knowledge, attention to the advertisement. And after controlling for these factors, we find that those in a life transition were significantly more likely to actively choose to continue enjoying that same ad versus express a preference for novelty and switch the ad when compared to those who are not currently experiencing a life transition. So, in summary, we believe that there's implications for advertisers and brand managers in incorporating these findings. Most broadly, there are increased opportunities to employ life transitions and targeting practices in this digital age. So we urge companies to consider increasing ad frequency to sustain ad enjoyment and favorable brand attitudes in this segment. We also find that effects generalize across different life transitions. So it's really not about the positive valence life transition of, for example, marriage, or negative valence life transition of divorce. Rather, it's that when consumers are forced to change and to adopt different behaviors, they're hesitant and they seek familiarity in their environment. So this is the case across graduation, moving to a new location, or retirement. And we also find that there's potential avenues for future research. This is an understudied topic, so we think assumptions from this research, it would be interesting to explore whether increasing ad frequency for product categories linked to life transitions might be effective. But overall, we encourage advertisers and brand managers to incorporate life transitions in their targeting practices. So I would like to thank the Journal of Advertising Research again, as well as the Advertising Research Foundation for this opportunity, as well as my colleagues, Tyler Milfeld and Luke Nolan, who are actually exploring the topic of life transition, both in academia as well as industry. And if you're interested in this topic, I'd be happy to answer any questions as well. So thank you.